Welcome. My name is Ben Waddell. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. I'm going to talk about the Electoral College today. The Electoral College is something that we're all familiar with, and we certainly become much more familiar with every 4 years. Certainly we're going to hear a great deal about the Electoral College as we move into the 2020 election, and we're all going to remember, very vaguely perhaps for some of us, or more specifically for others, about those basic civic lessons that we've heard about the Electoral College. And we're going to be reminded of the reasons that it exists. And the basic idea, the basic argument that we hear from very young age in growing up in the United States is that the ingenious nature of the Electoral College, indeed what allows a Republican democracy to work, is the ability of the Electoral College to balance rural states with urban states. That is, rural, less populated states with much more populated urban states. The argument goes, if it were not for the Electoral College, large urban states would dominate the political landscape and would make most of the decisions in our republic. I'm going to argue something quite different. And it may not sit well with you, but I ask that you at least entertain the possibility of the notion that I'm going to be presenting today. And that is this. The Electoral College systematically suppresses the voices of progressives and minorities in this country. And if minority voices are ever to matter in this country, the Electoral College needs to either be reformed or completely let go. That's the argument that I'm going to make. And I want to do that through 8 mini lessons. And we'll start with the first one here in a second. All right, lesson number 1. It's the system. When I say that the Electoral College system is racist, what I mean by that is not necessarily that the electors that cast the Electoral College votes or the individual politicians that are representatives as senators or congresspeople are racist in and of themselves. What I mean is that the structure of the Electoral College system favors the votes of rural white conservative voters over the votes of minorities in this country. And we'll get to why that is mathematically here in a second. But I want to give you an example of what systematic or structural racism can look like in the United States or really anywhere else. So I want you to consider a basic chart as we talk about this. The first chart is median income in the United States. Now, as you look at this median income chart, what you're going to notice is that, yes, the distribution favors white individuals, but it's not that large of an advantage. The favoritism that exists in terms of income is certainly a gap, and it is a gap that needs to be improved. But when we look across this, there's not a huge range between the least well-paid groups and the most compensated or well-paid groups in the United States. But I now want you to look at this second chart. This is median wealth. And when we look at median wealth, we see a much larger gap between minorities, specifically blacks and Latinos, and white individuals in this country. Now, this second chart is symbolic of all of the history that has come before the present day. Income measures what people are making in the moment, but wealth is a measure of all of those goods and things that people have. Wealth is basically, the basic idea of median wealth is if you were to add up and sell everything that you have as a family or an individual, in this case a family, this is what you would have. Right? And so white individuals in this country on average would have over $170,000. And as you can see, most minority groups have much less than that. Now, when we consider that, what is going into this is history. The fact that white individuals came to this country oftentimes at their own volition, they were able to save, they were able to vote, they were able to accumulate wealth over time, they were able to benefit from slavery and from other institutions that discriminated against the wealth accumulation of other groups. And over the course of 200, 300 years, right? So even before, in some cases, the United States becomes the United States, white individuals were accumulating wealth in this country. And what that allows white individuals to do is to accumulate a wealth that is then passed down from generation to generation. And that systematically favors that group when it comes to education, accessing healthcare, buying homes, and many other things in our everyday society. Now, the fact that white individuals today have more wealth than other racial and ethnic groups does not necessarily mean that white individuals in the present discriminate against those other groups. But what it does mean is that there is a deep history that structurally favors white individuals in this country. And that is what I mean when I say it's the system. The Electoral College system, similar to the intergenerational accumulation of wealth in this country, the Electoral College system systematically favors white voters. Lesson number 2. The Electoral College is complex. The Electoral College consists of 538 votes. 100 of those votes come from senators. There are 100 senators in the United States, 2 to each individual state. The other 438 of those votes come from a combination of representatives in Congress, so 435 of those, and then the other 3 from the 3 representatives from the District of Columbia. So together we get 538. 538 votes is the total amount of electoral votes that exist within the Electoral College system. Now you need 270 of those to win the presidency. That means that in the United States, the first one past the polls in the Electoral College system, past half, or 50% of the votes, wins the presidential election, irregardless of the results of the popular vote. And so in the Electoral College system, what we have is a system in which those individual states assign their votes to electors, and those electors, about a month after the actual election, cast their votes for typically the individual that wins the popular vote within their state. And so together across the nation, once a candidate reaches or gathers 270 votes from individual states, they are then named the next president of the United States. Lesson number 3. The Electoral College systematically favors rural states. Now, when I say this, I want to emphasize just how large the advantage is for rural states and just how large the disadvantage is, therefore, for urban states. In the United States, per one Electoral College vote in rural states, there are about 390,000 residents. But in urban states, there are over 590,000 residents per one Electoral College vote. And so we can look at this through an example. If you happen to live in Wyoming, where the ratio of residents to one Electoral College vote is about 190,000 to every one vote, and you move to Colorado, where the ratio is about 630,000 residents to every one Electoral College vote, the power of your vote actually loses about 70% of its weight. So think about that for a second. Simply moving from Cheyenne, Wyoming to Denver, Colorado leads to a 70% reduction in the value of your vote within the Electoral College system. That's how strong the rural advantage is within the Electoral College system. All right, lesson number 4. The rural tilt in the Electoral College system doesn't have that much to do with rural America. Historically, what it has a lot to do with is slavery. In 1787, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Southern states and Northern states debated representation within what became the Electoral College. Southern states were worried about their representation because 36% of their population was enslaved. Northern states, of course, wanted to maintain more representation because they had more of the population. Southern states ended up compromising with Northern states through the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise counted slave populations or individual slaves as 3/5 citizens, which increased the representation of Southern states within the Electoral College system and therefore gave them bigger play within presidential elections. That was the origins of the Electoral College. Now, there are those who argue that the Electoral College was really designed to balance between rural states and urban states, between highly populated states and less populated states. But the truth of the matter is that in 1787 at that convention, rurality or rural spaces would have had very little to do with this conversation because 95% of America was rural. 95% of the country lived in a rural area. And therefore, it wasn't a major factor, the balance between rural spaces and urban spaces in that conversation. What was a major factor was slavery. And so it is important to keep in mind that the Electoral College system has always systematically favored white voters. At first, in its inception, it favored white voters by design. And today, it favors white voters because of the structural and demographic arrangement of residents in the United States. Lesson number 5. The rural advantage, and specifically the systematic advantage of rural conservative white voters within the Electoral College system, has everything to do with demographic shifts during the 20th century. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, many people left the South. This specifically began to speed up in the 20th century when minorities, and specifically African Americans, left the South in the Great Migration to urban cities, both in the North as well as along the coast in the United States. Minorities left rural America because of discrimination. They left because they couldn't vote, because they couldn't sit in the front of the bus, because they were unable to participate in politics, they were unable to attend the same schools, and they were unable to use the same facilities within communities in southern parts of the United States, and especially as well in the Midwest and other rural parts of the country. And so naturally, many of these folks sought out more progressive spaces in larger cities in the north and along the coast. What that did is demographically change the United States. And of course, it changed the way in which the Electoral College influences the United States. Today, 44% of urban cities in the United States are white, but 79% of the US countryside is white. And so this massive polarization in terms of race and ethnicity of demographics in the United States has led to a situation in which the Electoral College systematically favors not only rural areas, but rural white voters. Lesson number 6. The Electoral College is mathematically racist. The Electoral College systematically favors white voters, but we can actually see this through math. And so I want you to think about this first chart, and then we'll jump into a second chart. The first chart looks at the percentage of each individual racial and ethnic group in this country. As you can see, white individuals make up about 60% of this country's population, and it goes down from there. Latinos 17%, African Americans between 12 and 13%, Asians around 6%, Native Americans around 2%, and so on and so forth. About 3% is made up by other. Now, when we think about this, we can create another chart. And this chart helps us understand the actual distribution of Electoral College votes according to each racial and ethnic group. If we look at the Electoral College in this next chart, and we look at the actual distribution of Electoral College votes per individual group, right? What we see is that white voters in this country have a clear advantage within the Electoral College system. Now, if we look at something a little bit different, we look at the proportional, if proportional percentage of Electoral College votes. So if we were to take the percentage that each individual group makes up within this country, so 60% white, and multiply that by 538, we get the if proportional Electoral College distribution. So if the Electoral College votes were proportionally given out to each one of these groups, what we get is the yellow bar next to the gray bar in this chart. Now, if we take the difference between those two, what we get is the advantage or disadvantage that each group has within the Electoral College system. And that brings me to this next chart. In the United States today, white voters on average have a 9 Electoral College vote advantage in this country. Now, if we look at the opposite extreme, Latinos or Hispanics in this country have a -8. That is, they have a disadvantage to the tune of 8 Electoral College votes against them in this country. African Americans and Asians are at -1, and Native Americans are just above at +1. What we see here is a clear relationship in which white voters have an amazingly, surprisingly, systematically, and mathematically demonstrated advantage within the Electoral College system. Lesson number 7. The biggest advantage in the Electoral College system for white voters is precisely in the swing states. It's all about the swing states. Every 4 years, we hear about the swing states, or the battleground states. The battleground states are the states that actually determine the presidential election in this country. In 2000, it was Florida, and the difference was only 500 votes, and the Supreme Court had to make the decision. In 2016, it was a combination of places like Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. In 2020, it's yet to be determined what will be the key states in determining the presidential election. But one thing that we can be sure of is that they will be battleground states. States like California and New York always go in the same direction for Democrats. States like Georgia, Arkansas, and others within the South, in the Deep South, go for Republicans. Now, there may be some states that flip in 2020. Maybe Texas will flip. Maybe there'll be others. But the battleground states will be the states that determine the presidential election. That much we can be sure of. And if we look at the battleground states, according to the last mathematical equations we were looking at, what we see is an even larger advantage for white voters. Within swing states, white voters have a 14 electoral college vote advantage, compared to a negative 14 disadvantage for minorities. And so it is not surprising that when we see presidential elections in the modern United States, or in recent history, in contemporary history in the United States, the issues seem to tilt not only towards rural America, but towards candidates and policies that favor rural conservative white voters. And that has everything to do with the fact that white voters have a huge electoral college advantage when it comes to the swing states. Lesson number 8, one person, one vote. The electoral college system is often defended within rural states through the argument that it would be unfair for large states like Texas and California and New York and Florida to have huge influence over the policy decisions that govern the lives of rural Americans. And I agree with that. But I also agree that it is unfair that rural states have systematically more power in decision-making in Senate and through the Electoral College in making policies that influence the lives of urban Americans living in places like California, Florida, Texas, and other states that have large urban areas. The fact of the matter is, over 80% of our country lives in an urban setting today. And in order for us to continue as a democratic nation, all of those individuals need to make sure or need to be assured that their votes count in presidential elections. They need equal representation. And I think the only way for us to move forward as a republic, and indeed perhaps the only way to save democracy in this country, is for us to reform the electoral college system in a way that gives equal voice to each individual vote. Every vote should count in this country. For every individual person, there should be one vote. And for every one vote, the weight of that decision should be exactly the same. The final lesson is engage. Indeed, no democracy has ever functioned well without citizen engagement. I would push you, I would encourage you, I would ask you to engage with thinking about the ways in which the electoral college system systematically work against what it means to be a democratic society. The democratic nation that functions best is the nation where citizens are engaged in the policy process. And the electoral college system currently sidelines way too many of our citizens from the policy-making process. And so I would ask you to think about the different options and alternatives that are out there. One of the options that I favor and that I support is the NPV, or the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact allows for states to compact together and decide that they will cast their electoral votes towards the person that wins the most popular votes within the nation. I think this is a fair way to think about reform of the Electoral College. If we were to sign on enough states to get past the 270 mark, it would not get rid of the Electoral College, but it would bring the Electoral College much more closely in line with the current demographic distribution of Americans in our country today. So, given that, I would ask that you consider supporting the NPV and that, in general, you engage with this issue. Way too many Americans fail to understand the way in which the Electoral College works and the way in which it suppresses votes. And I would ask for you to be a conduit to understanding the system. I think if more Americans understand the way in which the system works, we can move towards a better democracy. Because once more people understand how it works, I think there will be more of a push and an effort to reform the Electoral College. Thank you for participating in this conversation today. I hope that you'll continue the conversation by engaging your neighbors, your friends, your family members, and anyone else that'll listen. Help people understand how the Electoral College works so that we can consider how to reform it in a way that is in keeping with democratic societies. Thank you. Have a wonderful day and stay engaged.